Good evening, comrades. Thank you for joining us tonight for a session on the Social Democratic Party in Germany, which is very important for a number of reasons, but something undervalued and underrated, I think, especially on the British left, especially from a particular political background, perhaps, when you start talking about the SPD and it being having been a mass working class party, you get a bit of ridicule sometimes. You could look at what the SPD is like now, and it's not in a great state, no doubt, but it's gone through a massive development. And of course, the subject of our series is Marx, and Marx and Engels were very heavily involved in discussing programs to do with the SPD, etc., and trying to pull it to the left, which is why we're looking at it today. Also, one of the first mass working class parties, for certainly in Germany, and influenced a lot of other organizations, including the RSDLP, that is often ignored. So it's very worthwhile looking at it. Our main speaker tonight is Kevin Bean, who's joining us, even though he's a bit poorly. So thank you very much, Kevin, for powering through. If you have comments or questions, you can ask them after his introduction, or I can read them out. Over to you, Kevin.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Apologies, comrades, for if I'm a bit bunged up, but I think you can hear me. This evening's session is really an introduction to Marx and Engels' work as sort of political activists in one particular country. One which, for example, they kept many contacts with, they remained in constant contacts throughout their lives. And although they didn't visit that much in later years, were very familiar with its movement. And of course, in the period that we're looking at here, the 1860s and the 1870s, the German working class movement really grew and became, probably one of the most important working class movements in Europe. It's also a good example for us of how Marx and Engels related to sort of actual movements, real movements, as it were, and the type of advice and the sort of commentary that they gave towards people who were ostensibly their followers or who claimed to, be influenced by their ideas. I'm going to look at the various German working class organizations. This is not an exhaustive history, and indeed, such a history is beyond me. My German is very limited, and I can't read primary sources to any great extent. So I've had to rely upon secondary sources as well as Marx and Engels' own writings and so on. It's also, again, one of those problems which I've referred to before, that the Marx and Engels internet, or the Marxist internet archive, the online archive, doesn't have a full listing of many of the documents, and particularly the letters. And so you would have to search those out either by going to a library which has got the complete works of Marx and Engels, or one of the many sort of edited collections. David Fernbach's was one, in the 70s, but there are numerous other that you could choose from. So I'm going to try and also present the sort of problems that the German working class movement faced, and maybe get us to think about what they mean for us today, particularly in terms of this idea of party and program. And I'm trying to frame my my arguments around those two themes. Just a quick reminder, comrades, that when we use the word party, and certainly when Marx uses it, he's referring, I think, even in the 1860s, to a much more sort of fluid conception than maybe we're used to of a fairly clearly, rigidly defined party. with, a party card and a fairly clear set of boundaries. Indeed, pardon me. Indeed, when we look a little more closely at the German organizations, we'll see that what we think of as Marxism, or indeed what many people regarded as Marxism, then varied considerably from what Marx and Engels actually meant by that. So the definition of party, but also the idea of program, is also in the processes of formation. Again, comrades will recall that in the 1848 revolutionary period, Marx had issued material called The Demands of the Communist Party in Germany, which were clear a set of demands, along with the idea of there being a sort of trend of communist opinion. Pardon me, sorry. And so in a way, he's building on that. But also, he's relating to the very change situation which the First International creates. And indeed, he refers in his writings to the address of the International, the rules of the International, and how that is beginning to define working class politics and the working class program. The issues that I think we're going to encounter will not only be those of the nature of the program, and the most famous programmatic document that I've listed on the readings, the critique of the Gotha program, that critique shows us that Marx took questions of sort of program and definition very seriously. And indeed, I think that those of us who've been involved in the development of programs or in parties or in other left activities will know that many comrades often will be fairly sloppy, and this is a sin of my own making in the past, so I'm speaking from experience, in formulation, or indeed will sometimes, for the sake of compromise, let something go through on the basis that, well, it doesn't really matter. Marx, in that critique which he makes of the program, which brings together various sort of tendencies in the German social democratic movement to form what will become the SPD, is fairly, clear that definitions and meanings, and indeed quite strict discussions, are very important. And I think he's saying that partly because it's important for any new grouping to clarify, but also because the parties that we're talking about didn't just come, as it were, from Marx and Engels' head, or from Bebel or Liebknecht's head, but actually were developing from real movements, and indeed from various other currents in the German working class movement. Apart from the issue of the party and the program, the other issues I think that we come up here, or begin to encounter, are the relationship of the working class movement to the existing state. That in particular, that could the existing state be used in various forms? Could, for example, the transition to socialism be carried out through utilizing the existing state? And then perhaps more importantly, who should be the real target and the direction of a working class movement's policy? And this, I think, again, leads us back to something about the political background in Germany, which I would just like to begin with. In the 1860s, Germany was not a unified state. I've asked for some maps to be put onto the sort of background papers. There we are. Very good. Thank you, Tina. Now, this sort of is not a brilliant map, but I think what it gives you an idea of is in the 1860s, Germany was in fact a series of states. The most important, the most dominant one was, of course, Prussia in northern Germany. And the issue of the unification of Germany and how that unification was to be achieved, and indeed even where Germany actually was. What we have there is, in outline, the Germany that arrives after the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. But in Europe in the 19th century, and indeed I would say that there can still be some arguments about where Germany actually is. There's a German state, but for example, the Austrian Empire to the south of contemporary Germany was regarded historically as, you know, part of the Greater Germany. So should Germany's borders, for example, extend from Vienna and Prague all the way up to Schleswig in the north, and perhaps more importantly, should it be a loose confederation or a centralized state? So German unification, both in terms of its territory, but also how it was to be achieved. Would it, for example, be a democratic, revolutionary process of unification, rather like the processes that we might have seen resulting from 1848 or the various national liberation movements in that period? Or would it be a top-down affair, rather like Italian unification involving Piedmont? And also, as was to be the case with Prussia. So German unification, I think, is a major issue. And in particular, the attitude of socialists and of the working class movement to the nature of that unification project. So it means, I think, essentially that we have this debate within German socialism, and we also then have how do we react to the state? Now, the most important tendency in the German working class movement in the 1860s are the Lassallians, named after Ferdinand Lassalle, a very flamboyant figure. He very much a sort of, I was trying to think of a contemporary word, but a wire puller, a manipulator, you know, a behind-the-scenes operator. Also, you know, quite a good propagandist, quite a striking figure. Just to give you an idea, he died in a duel over the reputation of his lover, so very much in the 19th century romantic mold. And indeed, even though he died in 1864, just a few months, I think, before the foundation of the International, his memory did sort of live on. And indeed, I've seen in some German working class history museums, little sort of busts of Lassalle and even little commemorative plates of Lassalle and Marx together. So he has a sort of popular presence. Now, Lassalle's politics, are, I think, interesting for us because they, in many ways, echo the same sort of politics that we get when a working class movement starts to emerge. And these currents, I think we can see in other working class movements. We can certainly see it in the British working class movement and in the French. And this is the idea that the working class as a force is not strong enough to achieve its aims by itself. Very good. There we are. Yes. That's a very, there, you see, he's a very dashing character, isn't he? He's complete with sword and human rights and social democracy. Yes. Thank you, Tina. Yeah. Oh, and yes, I think that's where he was born, Matthew. He's born in Breslau. Yeah. So, in that sense, Lassalle's politics were those of a leader trying to negotiate and trying to obtain various concessions for the working class. Now, that again is not unusual. Trade union leaders and reformers and so on do that all the time. I'm not perhaps telling you anything that you don't know. But Lassalle's theoretical understanding of this was that the main target of opposition for the working class should be the capitalists. Now, again, comrades would say, well, that's fine. Marxists and leftists are opposed to capitalism, and obviously the main target for a working class movement should be capitalism. But Lassalle's argument was not just that that the working class movement should focus on its opposition to capitalism, but also that it should ally itself with the existing state. And by that, I mean the Prussian state. And that Prussian state, and that's why I think it's important to remember the nature of the state, is a bureaucratic, it's a military state in which the army is very powerful. It's a state which, for example, has very limited democratic rights. And although by the late 1860s, the right of universal suffrage is extended, it's certainly not democratic in any modern sense. Indeed, for much of the 1860s, it had been ruled in effect by the minister-president Bismarck, ruling without a parliamentary majority, and in fact, essentially a sort of monarchical regime. So the argument that the state, in some senses, could be a medium for social progress, for advance, is, I think, incredibly controversial. But it's also controversial in another sense, and that is that it tends, I think, to play down the importance of the political, and in particular, the idea that the bourgeois democratic demands and the focusing on the nature of that state, and in particular, the opposition to that state, is in any sense a distraction from the main working class struggle. Particularly as, and again, the experience of 1848 would illustrate this, the bourgeois liberals, we know, and in some of the documents that I have put up on the reading there for you, we know that Marx and others are aware of the cowardice and indeed the reluctance of the bourgeois liberals, particularly if they feel that the working class can mobilize as a powerful force to ally themselves with the working class, or indeed lead any serious democratic fight. Indeed, when the minister-president Bismarck effectively overrides the Landtag in Prussia and rules in a sort of extrajudicial way, they come up with various protests, but essentially do very little about it. And that, again, I think demonstrates their relative accommodation to the system. Now, these, I think, are important issues because the relationship of political democracy and political demand is a central one for Marx. And his argument is that the workers' movement should have its enemies, not just capitalism, but also the feudal landlords, the military bureaucratic caste. Remember that large areas of northern and eastern Germany still had the remnants of feudalism on the large estates, particularly in the so-called East of Elba area. And so the fight for democratic rights and the fight against the landlords and that ruling class, that would be, a major political task of the working class, not simply to fight, against the capitalists. Now, Lassalle's politics then were very much accommodation, I think, to the state. In that, I think he does mirror certain other tendencies in both German liberal thought. Indeed, you can argue, although I don't want to, dignify it with any particular sort of brand, that this mirrors some sort of Hegelian ideas of the universal character of the state. But for Lassalle, what this meant was that the demands were primarily directed towards the state, and indeed forms of negotiation with Bismarck. Marx surmised that that Lassalle had been negotiating with Bismarck, and that was later proved to be true. Lassalle's argument was that the state could provide credits for cooperatives, and that in particular, that Bismarck would be induced to introduce universal suffrage, and that this would then be a means of applying political pressure in that way. The other issue I think here, and this is again something that we need to have in the back of our minds, is that the experience of Louis Napoleon and his use of a plebiscitary regime, and also the concessions that were being made in other states, Britain, for example, with the 1867 Reform Act, or encouraging the idea that it might be possible in some senses to incorporate sections of the working class. And indeed, Bismarck later, takes this on board as a policy, and I think is in some senses quite successful with it, but that's a little later on. Now, initially, Marx and Lassalle cooperate, and indeed, they exchange letters and correspondence. But Marx does become increasingly critical, and following Lassalle's death, it becomes more critical of his followers, particularly Schweitzer, and the type of concessions that they were prepared to make to the German state, or the type of approach that they had to the German state. There was also another element in Lassalle's politics, which Schweitzer and many of the people that followed him, which was very much a sort of centralization, almost in a sense a mirror of the type of plebiscitary democracy in the workers' movement that Louis Napoleon had introduced. In other words, that Lassalle would be elected by the membership, but then would become, in a sense, the dictator, rather like, in the Roman sense of a dictator who would be given unlimited powers to work in that way. And that type of tradition of labor dictator or workers dictator carried on, and again was subject to criticism. The tendencies that were opposed to Lassalle were quite small initially. His organization, the General German Workers Association, was the much larger. There were other groupings, some of which were quite explicitly non-political, but increasingly, as Germany industrialized in the 1860s, they started to move into a political activity. Something that is, I think, going to be important really much later is what historians refer to as associational culture, which is essentially in German civil society. You would find a whole series of associations, self-help groupings, educational associations. Again, these would be functions of all sorts of societies, but in Germany they were particularly strongly developed. And the German working class movement built on those, often educational associations. Many of these had initially been established by bourgeois liberals as a way of preventing workers from sort of falling into bad habits and learning wrong things. And they were, again, to encourage habits of, modesty, propriety, and sobriety, and, good capitalist thinking. And indeed, many of the activists in the socialist movement often started in these associations and then progressed on into more explicitly political activities. There were also, as well as critiques of Lassalle's or the Lassallians, because Lassalle is dead after 1864. There are also critiques of the very strongly pro-Prussian position, and also some critiques as well of the position in relation to the state. Amongst those critics are two comrades, August Bebel and Wilhelm Liebknecht, who are close to Marx. Liebknecht in particular had spent time in London with Marx, and they developed a smaller current which went through various incarnations. Again, I don't intend to look at the political genealogy in any detail, but their origins lay outside of Prussia, particularly in Saxony. And I think this is significant because the point that I was making about the national question and the attitude towards Prussia, I think, is going to be important. They were less enamored of the Prussian state, and indeed, particularly in the case of Liebknecht, had tended towards a certain sympathy for the so-called Großdeutsch argument about incorporating the Austrian Empire, or the German-speaking areas of Austria, into a loose confederation. But these currents start to coalesce. They publish newspapers, and in 1869, as a result of a number of splits, both from some bourgeois liberal groupings, but also from a sort of radical petty bourgeois group, the Saxon People's Party, they form the Social Democratic Workers' Party, the SDAP. And this party is ostensibly Marxist, and indeed its program, where it's drawn up in Eisenach, is much closer to the politics of the First International. And indeed, when Marx comments on the Gotha program, says that it's a superior program to that of the United, what would be the SPD in 1875. Now, one of the again important factors we need to remember is that both in the North German Confederation, which Prussia had essentially created through both wars of conquest involving Denmark and also a war against Austria in 1866, that had brought essentially the whole of northern Germany within the orbit of Prussia. And in that orbit there were institutions, democratic institutions, which enabled workers to organize and indeed to get elected. And both Liebknecht and Bebel were elected. And indeed, at the time of the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, they were members of the what would become the Reichstag. It was then the Bundestag of the North German Confederation. And so they were in a position to argue for their politics. They were in a position to actually make speeches and to make critiques of the war, and indeed of the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, the seizing of Alsace-Lorraine from France and their incorporation into what would become the German Empire. Alsace-Lorraine was a Reichsland. It was a sort of area administered, in effect, directly by the empire, in practice by Prussia, in effect. So, for example, it would be very clear that this movement is in a much stronger position than, say, any equivalent in Britain. And the impact of speeches by, leading workers' leaders attacking the expansionist policies of the Prussian state, and indeed calling, in opposition to annexations, would obviously have a major impact. It meant, for example, that those two leaders, both in this period, but then later, in the 1870s and after the anti-socialist law in 1878, spent considerable amounts of time in prison. And although, some of the prison terms were not particularly harsh, it certainly was very restrictive. And it, again, adds another element to this movement that we're looking at. Now, what I've been trying to describe is the nature of this movement, and in particular, to give you a sort of flavor of it, but also to make the point that Marx and Engels are, in a sense, outside observers. They have some supporters. They're able to communicate, they're able to put forward their ideas. But, in the middle 1860s, their direct influence, certainly at the time that the First International was established, is fairly limited. Indeed, and it may well be a product of various laws that prevented German working class organizations from affiliating to international bodies. Individual members of the International were fairly thin on the ground in Germany. So although these organizations were quite large, and indeed in the case of the general German workers, it would number, tens of thousands of members. And then when it began to expand as a trade union and not simply as a sort of an association, it grew larger still. The movement is not essentially a sort of offspring of Marx and Engels. The Eisenachers, the group who Bebel and Liebknecht, in a sense, bring together in 1869, are regarded as Marxists, and Marx does have a certain influence there. But I think it's important to note that much of what Marx is understanding by the formation of a party and of a program is in many senses a reaction to what he sees. And I think this is quite important, in terms of Marx, not just simply coming up with a blueprint and saying, this is what you do, but actually saying, well, this is what you're doing, this is what I think you should do. So much of what Marx and Engels are doing, I think, is, being sort of played out practically in Germany, in the same way, for example, that Engels and Marx as well, to a certain extent, observed events in Britain with the Chartist movement and, formulated their ideas on working class action, through that experience. So I think if we're thinking about the importance of these movements, we're thinking that, that this is how Marx and Engels are now reacting to a real movement and how they think it should develop. So, for example, in their critiques of the secret negotiations with Bismarck, they're calling for a working class independence, the importance of that. When, for example, they have reservations about the role of the Prussian state in unification, they again are referring to the actual role of that state and the nature of that state. So this is not a sort of just theoretical idea. They're looking at how it's developing in practice, and I think this means that the importance of what we see here and how it shapes Marx and Engels' ideas shouldn't be, underestimated. It also means that the phenomenal growth of the German socialist movement and its success does become something of a model, and it, in a sense, it then develops its own sort of dynamic. It then becomes a model that people aspire to, which we will discuss in succeeding succeeding talks. Not only does it grow to be by 1912 the largest single party in the Reichstag, but its sort of reach and its nature across German society is very extensive. And it's this, I think, that impresses people like Lenin, or indeed any visitor to Germany. All the reports we have of foreign visitors going to Germany in this period all refer to the sort of depth of this movement that's starting to develop. Now, this depth, though, comes at something of a cost, and I want to, in particular, just spend a little time before I finish up looking at what is the major document that I've put up for you to look at. In Marx's own terms, it's actually marginal notes on the program of the German Workers' Party. And this was a critique of the Gotha program that was the sort of unification program that brought together the Lassallians and the Eisenachers in 1875. The negotiations and indeed the drafting of the program was jointly handled by Liebknecht, and I think it's Hassemann, my just escaped me now for the moment, from the General German Workers' Association. Now, for reasons of communication, it seems, although again, this in and itself is interesting, and some of the letters that relate to this don't appear to be extant, it seems that Marx and Engels were not drawn into the very detailed discussions about the program and indeed about the unity question until it was essentially over. Indeed, if you read the covering note that I've included in the section, they refer to the fact that that they'd only heard about this conference after it had happened, and that the program had been agreed. And in a sense, they're sort of almost saying, well, what's going on here? Now, I think the detailed critique, and again, it's far too detailed to go through section by section. I will summarize it. But I want to try and think about the thinking here, and in particular about its impact. The need for clarity, particularly in a period when what we define as socialism or the left is still unclear, is, I think, upmost in Marx and Engels' mind. Now, as I say, all comrades will have been in meetings where we've been drawing up programs. I mean, there are some people in this session now who I've sat down with in various meetings, and we've gone over including this demand and that demand and so on. So we're all very familiar with the process. And we all, I think, know why we do it. Now, for some comrades, the arguments around the fine words or including a particular set of arguments are often subordinate to, well, we need, broad general unity. In other words, there is a sort of minimum basis that we can develop our program on. So you can see that this critique, and indeed the arguments behind it, are not just simply that Marx is being a bit picky about the nature of the role of labor in the creation of value and the relation of labor and nature, or the labor theory of value, or the iron law of wages. He's not just being sort of picky about that and saying, look, this is my line and you should adhere to it. Because what he sees as lying behind many of these points isn't just, sloppiness or, bad thinking, and he's pretty scathing about it in the critique. But he also sees a political drift and a political tendency within it. And in particular, he sees that the Lassallean arguments, particularly about the nature of the state and about the way that the state, for example, could be utilized by a socialist movement, lurk behind many of the demands. Now, I don't think at this stage, although, some writers who are looking for the original sins of the Second International and, try to go back as far as they can, will see the sin of reformism here. I don't think that's quite what Marx is saying. But what he is saying is that unless you're very clear on some of these key points, then you can make, political concessions. And I suppose as well, something which, we are currently discussing on the left. I mean, there are any number of initiatives at the moment, and I don't really want to sort of get into them, but I do want comrades to think about this. What sort of program should a new party to the left of Labour have? And, what is the point of that program? And it again would seem to me that Marx is at a much earlier stage, but he's faced with the same problem. Does he, for example, make concessions to the Lassalleans and hope that it will all be ironed out, and that, once everybody gets into this party, it will be, one large grouping, and that this will, that the differences will be ironed out and that people will come around? Or are we sort of planting a flag in the sand and in fact, laying down particular, defining points in that way? Now, I've talked about some of the, seemingly abstract ideas about, the nature of value, the nature of capitalism, which, do echo Lassallean and indeed many radical petty bourgeois ideas, the sort of things that would be, fairly widely understood by German radicals of that period. But Marx goes pretty heavily to war with them, particularly around ideas of justice, ideas of rights, ideas of equality, not because he's opposed to equality, but he's arguing that the nature of oppression is obscured by many of these demands. But I think that probably his most important set of arguments there are on the question of the state, and indeed on the question of internationalism, where he argues that the current program, the Gotha program, does not establish the idea of the working class and of the workers' movement as an international movement, and that it does, in a sense, argue for, in a sense, a sort of national road to socialism. In the critique, he does refer to his the Communist Manifesto, where he says that the nature of the struggle should be, national in form but international in content. And I think it's quite important that since the International is already in the early 1870s is already going through crisis, but the experience of the International Workers' Movement shows the importance of internationalism, but also shows the importance of capitalism as an international phenomenon. So the idea of simply focusing on Germany and not seeing the struggle. Marx makes a very good point that the German bourgeoisie don't see their struggle, and the German state doesn't see its struggle as a simply national one. They see it as part of a wider European, indeed global-wide question, and so should the working class movement. The other areas of critique, I think, and this is again significant, are political demands on the question of the state, particularly the idea of the free state, and indeed the role of the state in the transition towards communism. And again, the nature of that transition, and indeed it's in those sections we have Marx discussing, it's one of the very few sections where he's talking about how he thinks that transition might develop, talking particularly about the nature of the state, but also about the idea of a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat and what again that would mean. So what we have, I think, in this critique is a fairly clear delineation of what a Marxist party should uphold. Now, comrades, I hope you may well be already familiar with this, and I mean, it is the sort of text that most people read. But if you haven't, please have a look at it. The question that has been in my mind for a very long time about it, and I've looked in the correspondence such as I can find, and it's why this critique didn't appear in public until 1891. In other words, around about 15 or so years after it was written. Now, if Marx is so keen on establishing lines of demarcation, and indeed in the text that he associates with it, he says that he's going to, publicly denounce it, and that he's very upset with Liebknecht and his comrades for agreeing to this and so on. I think what emerges is that not only the pressure of events, because very shortly after that, repression does begin against German socialists. And indeed, in 1878, the anti-socialist law, which effectively bans the socialist movement, although through a loophole, it allows the deputies in the Reichstag to continue to function. It means that the SPD goes underground from 1878, and throughout the 1880s, it becomes an underground organization, publishing newspapers and smuggling them into Germany with a famous red post office with a series of trusted people, Vertrauensmänner, but then that becomes Vertrauenspersonen, it becomes women as well. And that period of the anti-socialist law, I think, does have a very powerful effect. And there is another argument which appears in a letter in 1876, where Marx suggests that that in effect that the sloppiness of the program has not had the dramatic effects, and that he has found criticisms that have been made by many of his followers, and so that in effect the the misdirection is being sort of clarified in progress. It's certainly true that when the SPD became effectively legalized in 1890 and was then able to hold a conference, its first major conference, although there was one in Halle, its first major conference in Erfurt did revise the program, which is a topic for a later session, even though I do mention Erfurt. But that's just to sort of whet your appetite for the future. So we've really looked at the sort of formation of this movement. We've looked in particular at the sort of political questions it's facing in the context. And I think we've also looked that in many ways, Marx and Engels learned from it and then in a sense tried to teach it. And that I think is important because, in the early period of Marxism, which, is a long time ago, but we have to use a certain amount of historical imagination, is to sort of remember that the traditions that we build upon, and indeed the experiences, whether they be the Russian Revolution or reformism, don't exist. And so, we're going right back to the beginning. And, everybody in a sense is, learning and developing. And I think that's what makes this period so interesting and indeed so important for us. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you very much, comrade. As always, fascinating insights into a really important period of our history. A couple of questions before I open it up to comrades from the floor. If you want to ask a question or make a contribution, comrades, please click raise hand under reactions. And there's lots of people clapping you in the chat. I hope you can see that. And that really is the question of the state, which is the crucial question for the Gotha program, as you discuss, but also is still pertinent today. What do we do with the state, isn't it? How can we get from here, capitalism to socialism, communism? How many stages do we have to go through? And perhaps if you could, I know it's another issue that we perhaps have to have a separate session on, this issue of, do we smash the state? Does it wither away? Which state withers away? Is it the worker state that withers away? How does the dictatorship of the proletariat fit into that, which we discussed actually last week? And we pointed out that for Marx and Engels, dictatorship of the proletariat was not a dictatorship over the rest of society, but the rule of the working class, the rule of the majority. That's what they meant in the Roman sense. It's just the rule of the majority, not a bloodthirsty, bloody reign of terror. But where do how did their thinking develop in that period? And understand that the Paris Commune, the experience of the Paris Commune also changed their thinking a little bit about that. But this was after the Paris Commune of 1871. So how do they view, obviously they're critiquing Lassalle and his form of state socialism, who, his secret negotiations with Bismarck, as somebody pointed out in the chat, he went away and then, banned the party as a thank you to Lassalle, a posthumous thank you to Lassalle. That's obviously not the way that Marx and Engels wanted to engage with the state, i.e. to make secret deals and hoping that if only, the Bismarck, the monarch could give us some more rights and could give us direct universal suffrage, which Lassalle was very keen on. And he thought universal suffrage would sort of lead to socialism. If everybody can vote, that's one way to get to socialism, etc. But, in opposition to that, how did they see the taking hold of the state, or via smashing the state, withering away? How do you see that development?
Well, I think you're right, Tina, to bring in the Paris Commune, because I think that does have quite a big impact on their thinking. But I think the elements in Germany are where you have a, probably, I'm trying to think other than the United States and Switzerland, which has a certain sort of primitive forms of democracy. You have probably the most democratic state form in Europe in terms of universal suffrage of men over 25 in the German Empire. So the utilization of that, and in particular, the putting demands on that state in terms of, for example, limiting working hours and provision for education and so on. In other words, using that agitationally, was an important point. But it's also very clear from the critique of the Gotha program, where they're talking about, the nature of the state. If I can just find it a second, it's clear that they're talking about a very different type of society. They're talking about one that is not just a democratic society. It is a new ruling class, and it is a revolutionary dictatorship. It says, what transformation will the state undergo in a communist society? In other words, what social functions will remain that are analogous to the present functions of the state? The question can only be answered scientifically, and even a thousandfold combination of the word state and the word people will not bring us a flea hop nearer the problem, solving the problem, I suppose. Between capitalist and communist society lies a period of revolutionary transformation from one to the other. This is a corresponding period of transformation in the political sphere, and then in this period, the state can only take the form of a revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think it's that, and holding that as an aim, and saying that we do want a communist society and that the state has a function under capitalism, but also that the workers' state has an analogous but a different function under communism. So I think that there is, for example, nothing in there that can really give much sort of succor to the sort of peaceful road to socialism, or the arguments that you simply build up parliamentary majorities. Although later, both Engels, primarily Engels, says that it's probable that in countries where the working class is both the overwhelming majority and where the workers' movement has secured a very strong position, that it would probably be best tactically to in a sense allow the bourgeoisie to make the first move. In other words, to give the moral advantage to the working class movement. There is some debate. It's one of these sort of throwaway lines, and I suspect that what Engels is really arguing for there is that the bourgeoisie will resist, and that he's thinking of the role of the various intermediate classes, the ones, for example, that in the Gotha program are denounced as one reactionary mass. I left that section out. My apologies for not referring to that. So I think the other area where it becomes refined is when the German socialists start to emerge as a very powerful bloc. Then that does throw up the possibilities of the seizure of power fairly imminently. But even so, and I think you're right, that this idea of revolutionary dictatorship is not really connected with barricade fighting. It's the idea that the state's function is to represent a class, and that class then has political power, and that class will then begin the task of the creation, the working class will begin the task of creation of the new society. So it's campaigning for extensions to democracy, or campaigning on democratic demands in general, is important to raise the issue of democracy, particularly as Germany is deficient in that regard. But it's still, as part of these demands for communism. And I think in particular, given the struggle for democracy in Germany, particularly around groups like the People's Party, the Progressives, and indeed the German liberalism, and Marx makes this point quite early on, and he makes this point against Lassalle, that we should not simply ignore these questions because they're bourgeois democratic questions. They're important for the working class as immediate questions to allow us to organize and function. So I think that's the relationship. But it is, this section in the Gotha program is the one which I think has some of the clearest ideas about what the state will do, and in particular, its role in that transitional period. And that's the idea that it is a transition, that it's not just simply putting, as Lenin made the point about the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union, a red tin of paint over it.
Yeah, revolution permanent. You have to win it
yes.
over and over again. Okay, we have a few comrades now with their hand up. Ken first.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, and thank you, Tina. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Right. A fairly straightforward question. Is there any record of Schweitzer replying to the letter that Marx sent him, or indeed any actual exchange between Schweitzer and Marx, or did both parties simply remain of their own way of thinking? Was there any sort of dialogue between them on these disagreements? Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a couple more, should I? Ray wanted to ask a question. Ray, are you there?
No, I didn't have a question as such. I was just responding to requests coming up on the screen to start my camera.
Oh, yeah, you had your hand up.
Oh, no, I didn't.
You didn't? Okay, it was a mistake then. Okay, I'll make you an attendee again. Victor, you had your hand up.
Good evening, Tina and comrades. These history lessons are interesting in as much as we 21st century socialists can learn things from history. The standing lesson from all these histories of Marxism is that Marxism needed to remove existing anti-socialist states, and invariably this had to be done by forming anti-state coalitions, often, as happened in the case of the Russian Revolution, with people that the Marxists didn't agree with. Kerensky being an obvious example, and later on he had to be replaced. Even Joe Stalin, when he entered Eastern Europe with a massive Red Army, still found it necessary when establishing alternative governments in Poland, Hungary, East Germany, etc., to form coalitions with people who were not avowedly communists in order to achieve communist states in those countries. And that is a very telling example. I think what is rather worrying about the present situation in Western Europe is that many socialists and Marxists are divided, and many are even co-opted by the state. In the UK, the plutocratic deep state establishment's next choice of leader is Keir Starmer, and there will be many Marxist socialists will be saying we've got to vote for Starmer at the next election. Likewise in France, Macron is able to count on support from the far left, even though his police are fighting them simultaneously on the streets over measures like pension cuts. We need to bring Marx's strategy up to date at some point. Also, I think we need to bring up to date an essential tenet of Marxism, and that is that the world is being dominated by an exploitative ruling capitalist class, which is basically trying to rule over and exploit the majority, being the working class all over the world. Very rarely have there been Marxist internationals, but several times a year, every year, the capitalists have their international, the Bilderberg Group, the World Economic Forum meeting in secret, and of course the group that Keir Stormtrooper belongs to, the Trilateralists. I hope at some point we will bring this series up to date and analyse the groupings that the capitalist opposition are using to control and exploit the majority of us. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, Victor. I think he's in the pub. Helen, did you want to speak? Helen Smith? You've raised your hand earlier and I made you panelist. Helen? Might have been a mistake. If you want to ask a question or come in, you can now speak. Helen? No, I think that was possibly a mistake. Then I'll make you an attendee again. Comrades, is there anybody else who has a question or a comment? I'll get back into it. Kevin, you'll be pleased to hear. I'm just wondering in terms of what we can learn from Marx's critique of the Gotha program in particular, because this is now the period we are looking at. Do you see parallels perhaps where today certain socialist or movements or organizations are repeating some of the mistakes that were made at the time? The kind of, there's a huge difference, isn't it, between taking democratic demand seriously and appealing and, sort of fighting for those democratic political demands in a revolutionary manner. For example, as I said earlier, Lassalle was very keen on universal suffrage, which of course is a huge democratic demand, but he went about it by going to Bismarck and having secret meetings and pleading, and it makes sense rationally, etc. Do you see something? There's a campaign for PR, for example, which reminds me a little bit of a similar way of going about it. You leave away the rest of the program for revolution or for the needs of the Communist Party, and just focused on that one demand, and you think that's gonna do it. Is there something similar today where you think some organizations perhaps appealing more to the state, or thinking that a more left-wing government would get us more and more left-wing, and that's gonna get us to socialism automatically, more sort of in a stages type way? So yeah, that's really my question. What's the key thing we can learn from the Gotha critique?
Well, that's not a difficult question to answer at all, Tina.
Good.
I think I'll actually just reply to a couple of the other points there. First of all, to Ken, about Schweitzer. I think that after 1869, Marx doesn't correspond, or at least we don't have any letters. I've just done a quick check. One of the things I even in my little volume said that we don't have some of the original letters that Marx sent, and vice versa. We don't have sort of Schweitzer's letters to him. So I think that certainly on the index that I looked up, there isn't anything after 1869. I would imagine that Schweitzer's role in the German General Workers' Organization, he sort of, took a back seat largely for reasons of incompetence. I would think he probably fades from the scene in terms of Marx, but that's about the best I can do, Ken. My apologies. I find it very frustrating. I mean, I'm quite fortunate in that I've got a university library, and that's when the workers aren't out on strike, meaning that I can't go in and look at the letters. But, some of this material, when everybody says to you, it's all on the internet, well, it isn't. And sometimes you've got to go look at books. But I will follow it up because, and I've got a few other secondary sources. So thank you for that question. On Victor's question about bringing Marxism up to date, well, I think that's an interesting question, and it's one that I'm afraid I'm not qualified to do because I'm a mere sort of jobbing political activists. I can bring it up to date in cooperation with the comrades who are around this table, and we can discuss it. And I think, Marxism is a scientific, and by that I mean an organized body of study and of evidence. It's a discipline. It's not just, and it works in that way. So there are obvious developments in Marxism which are important. I think your point about co-option and about the role of labor leaders is one that Marx probably would have been familiar with, because Lassalle in some ways is, although he's a much more flamboyant figure than Keir Starmer, I'm afraid I couldn't imagine Keir Starmer fighting the duel over the honor of a lady. He's quite I did Lassalle in school. I always remember reading an article in the magazine History Today, and I always thought it was like something out of one of these, sort of Parisian operas, or Tales from Hoffmann or something or the other. It seemed very dramatic, but the same thing is true, and I think this leads on to probably Tina's point, which I'm only going to talk about generally, because one, I think it doesn't deserve a flip reply. But I think what is perhaps missing from our discussions on the left is the sort of possibilities of the working class becoming a force internationally. Of the working class becoming a force internationally. And I don't say that because, I think there's going to be a revolution next week. And I don't say that because, I'm disillusioned at all, far from it. But I was thinking that, at the great depths of the Marxist movement, when it's at its lowest ebb, for example, after the defeat of the 1848 revolution, or the defeat of Chartism, or the betrayal in the First World War, it was then quite possible for Lenin to point to a movement that could still had a formal commitment to revolutionary change. And I think what's happened in it depends where you want to draw the line, but in maybe the century and a half or so, the possibilities of the working class acting as a revolutionary force have been, negated by many on the left. And by that, I don't just mean going on strike or taking part in protest campaigns. I mean the idea of the working class, self-emancipation, the revolutionary class, the class that will transform society. And I think quite a lot of our politics sort of starts from the basis that, you know, we can't really achieve very much than sort of minimal demands. And indeed, you know, some of our politics are often framed in quite gradual stages and steps. And that means, you know, as Victor makes the point about, you know, allying with different currents. When the Bolsheviks allied with the left SRs, and they actually, you know, adapted or stole, if you want to think about it that way, they adapted the program of the left SRs because it represented a real movement. And I think what we are, you know, what we don't have today is that sense of the possibility of the working class winning over intermediate layers. Well, in the critique of the Gotha program, Marx attacks the idea that everybody other than the proletariat is one reactionary mass. And I think it may be Engels somewhere else says, you know, about 2/3 of the German population are rural. You know, many of them are peasants, they're landless laborers. And those are the people you've got to win over. You know, you've got to offer them something. And there's a big, you know, what's interesting is in some parts of southern Germany where we later get the revisionist tendency, they're the ones who actually ignore the peasant question. You know, funnily enough, they're the ones who don't really, you know, deal with it very seriously. So if you were to put that question to me, I think what we've got to do is not just look at this period of Marxism, but we've got to look at, I suppose, the whole experience of the working class movement and think about, you know, the mistakes that we've made. And I use the word we because like many of the comrades on this call, I've been involved in left-wing politics in one way or another since I was about 15 years old. You know, I'm not personally responsible for all the defeats and the cock-ups. I was far too minor a figure, but I dare say that if I'd been in any sort of leading position, I would have made all the same mistakes. So, you know, from that point of view, I think looking at these sorts of issues, but also, you know, looking at how Marx in particular was trying to move from small circles of people towards mass movements. And I think we have lessons to learn there, you know, and I think that is, you know, probably the important thing. I do think though, and again, I think Tina, you know, you won't be surprised if I say this, that the important focus on program and of sort of raising the sights of people beyond either economic demands or indeed, you know, just, you know, the usual type of demands, raising the issue of international socialism, of an international working class, you know, the nature of capitalism is, I think, quite important.
I also noticed, I think in the Gotha program, they critique the demand for, you know, to just have to have a fairer distribution of wealth, and transform that new organization that is being founded at the moment has as its first point. You know,
yeah, and you see, Tina, that's quite an important point. I think, you know, I could imagine. Well, I couldn't imagine, say, when I was a lot younger and I might be in a room full of, you know, non-political people and someone might start talking about politics and I might say, you know, about wealth. And someone would say, well, what we need are fair shares. Now, everybody could say, yeah, what we need are fair shares. But of course, I would come in and say, well, what do you mean by fair and where does wealth come from? That's why I didn't get invited to many parties as a teenager. But the important point, I think, Tina, is that you can go along with that, you know, and I think everybody can agree, yeah, we're all in favor of fair shares, or we all want equality. And, you know, if you were in, you know, some forms of society, you know, pre-capitalist societies, then those might even be revolutionary demands. You know, I remember that one of the Trotskyist parties in Sri Lanka, the translation of its name was something like the Equal Shares for All Party, which at first sounds maybe that's not right, but in the context of some aspects of Sinhala culture, it was a radical demand. I mean, that's an interesting point. You know, if, for example, in, say, a tribal society, raising the question of land distribution and fair distribution of land to the people who work it, is that a revolutionary demand, you know, and so on. But I suppose we're now in a world in which it isn't just about sort of fairness. We're actually talking about how wealth is made, how it's distributed, and indeed how we can deal with you know, the problems of society globally. So those sorts of ideas are, I think, you know, are far too vague. We've moved beyond it, I think. You know, I think you know, we have to go back and sort of think about how we might present it. But I think when Marx criticizes that, he's not doing it just to be picky. You know, he's doing it for a good reason, because he's pointing out the real nature of, you know, what that distribution of power and wealth is. You know, it's not just through wicked landowners, or it's not just through, you know, greedy employers. You know, it does have, you know, it's a systemic issue. And also in talking about the nature of value and about the role of the working class, you know, it isn't then just a case of, you know, getting concessions to the ruling class. It's talking about the real robbery that's carried out under capitalism.
And of course, the question of who actually owns the means of production. I mean, if you have a pre-capitalist society where they all share ownership, then you can distribute it evenly. You know, then the producers are those who are getting it distributed to. But in, you know, capitalist society, you actually have to take it away from some people if you want to distribute it. But I don't think that's something there. You know, I think by talking about distribution, they think they can get around having to talk about taking over things, because gets a bit too deep into you know, what communism is, etc. Okay, I'll shut up now.
And that's exactly what Marx says in the Critique. He says that they're focusing on distribution and not the creation of wealth and ownership. He says that the focus is on distribution. Yeah.
And it's quite astonishing that there's people on the left who call themselves Marxists who repeat those mistakes, probably on purpose. Matthew.
Yeah, my comments. No, I think what you're just saying. I mean, what gets me about the left, and you know, particularly the various groups, is not the fact they make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. The question is, can you learn from your mistakes? And the problem with these organisations is you have a position where, well, they've always been right. They're always right, and therefore you can't learn from anything if you're always right. You know, and therefore, you know, when you go through these massive struggles and so on, you come out the other side. There's no discussion about what happened, and you know, where you made mistakes and what can you learn from them, you know, and how do you do things differently? No, it's always, well, we were right, and therefore we don't need to talk about it, and they don't, and that's it. And therefore, you know, nobody learns anything, which is just unbelievable. It's just crap, you know, it's ridiculous. I think the thing that impressed me, I think, you know, about the SPD, you know, the structure of the party really is in some ways this sort of effect of the anti-socialist law, whereby, you know, basically Bismarck outlaws socialists, and therefore says if you declare yourself socialist, therefore you're exiled from civil society, and therefore they have to set up everything themselves. So that, you know, essentially they have to then set up a shadow society, and all things are encompassed, you know, everything from cycling clubs, swimming clubs, you know, social clubs, all this stuff, you know, so they actually sort of set up this whole structure, and therefore, you know, you have all of this stuff within the sort of a political party, which is, you know, has an extraordinary effect, as well as obviously, you know, the trade unions and so on and so forth. So in those terms, it's, you know, and just, you know, it doesn't actually stop the anti-socialist law, despite, you know, driving the press underground and all the rest of it. doesn't stop the growth of the party, or indeed the growth of its vote, which is an extraordinary thing. It just shows you that the potency of the ideas. So in those terms, I think the other thing, of course, is that always the issue of having the availability of Marx. The fact that Marx is published so late. If Marx was published contemporary to or semi-contemporary to the event, then obviously it would have been available to whole slews of people, most of whom, of course, didn't get a chance to read the stuff, and therefore couldn't see what Marx thought about, particular events. Only we have seen this, in many cases, some cases, many decades later, after all the people involved were dead. So, in those terms, it's an extraordinary development.
Thank you, Matthew. Kevin, do you want to reply straight away, or shall I take some other comrades?
I will just briefly respond. I think you're right on the question of mistakes. I suppose I'm probably unusual on the left in that I acknowledge that most of the things I've done are mistaken. So I'm still. I don't think I was always right. And I'm in a period of some questioning. So I think, though, that the issue of questioning, and this I think is where the Russian Revolution and the nature of the Russian Revolution, indeed the sort of society that was produced, is, I think, still quite a central question. Not only because it was the world's first worker state, but also it's not just it's something of an historical albatross, but also it does pose many questions about what we think of as socialism. And so looking at that and thinking of that experience, I think, is quite central. I think your point about the SPD will come up in a later session about how the party developed. So yes, that's good. I'm particularly interested in the SPD's vegetarian section. They had virtually everything, the workers' cycling clubs, artist groups, Esperanto, and of course, literature and so on. And I think your point about the publication of Marx's ideas, Matthew, is an interesting one, because one of the things that I often look at when I go to the Marxist online archive is I try to work out when did that piece appear, and it often is considerably later. And in the case of some of the material, it can actually be even as late as the 1930s or 40s. And if we go into some of Marx's theoretical, work, particularly things like the Grundrisse and so on, a lot of that isn't coming out and being translated into English, certainly, until the 1960s. It is quite interesting. I know some comrades who've done research work, say on the SPD, looked at what SPD members were reading. And there's actually quite an interesting book, which is a doctoral thesis by Richard Evans about the SPD in Hamburg. And it's actually something about the role of pubs, but also the way that the state used the pubs to find out what was going on. And they kept sort of records of what was being discussed. And what I think is interesting is that articles that appeared in the German socialist newspapers were considered more influential. So in other words, apart from, say, the Communist Manifesto and one or two pamphlets that might be available, it was what German socialists were writing, which they said is Marxism, that actually, shaped the way they thought. And that's even more the case when you look at, say, British publications like Justice, and you see, in a way, all sorts of distortions, but, and all sorts of sort of local variations. So I think your point is well made on that one.
Just briefly, that one point Matthew made, which is interesting. Did the ban actually help the SPD to organize, you think? did it just totally backfire, or could the SPD have been even bigger if there hadn't been a ban? Because clearly there was something happening for them to.
Well, it's a counterfactual question. I think it probably did help them, and I think what it certainly did. I'm not sure that it created that world within a world, because I think to a certain extent, Tina, I don't know whether this is still the case in Germany, but that associational society around all sorts of groups. I mean, I'm thinking of churches. I mean, I know of other examples in other countries where groups are, in a sense, out. They may not be formally banned, form their own association. So they have their own schools, they have their own informal social care, they have their own pubs, and so on and so on. So I think exclusion probably helped them, but I think it built on something that was already there. So it wasn't that they thought, how are we going to get around this? I think they already had it. If you think about, I mean, a group who did something of the same would be the Catholic Church and the Kulturkampf and the Centre Party, which did more or less the same sort of thing, and it had the church institutions. And that again added to the cohesion. It certainly didn't destroy the Catholic Church. It actually solidified it in many parts of southern Germany. Of course, that was added to by the whole, anti-Prussian thing. When I was in Bavaria not this summer gone, but the summer before, they were still referring to people north of Nuremberg as Prussians.
Yeah, that's a common thing. Thank you. Diana, and then Ian.
Where does the concept of GDP, gross domestic product, fit within Marxism? Was there an equivalent to it in Marx's time? And what would Marx have to say about it? And the obsession, a current obsession with growth, even though growth does nothing for the proletariat and trashes the environment. And GDP measures a lot of stuff that's destructive, such as arms production and useless industries that are environmentally destructive. Oh yes. And all the work done so far on the HS2 thing that's getting scrapped, like destroying ancient woodland. Where does that fit?
Thank you, Diana. Ian.
Good evening, comrades. Just wanted to ask about is it possible to see the point at which the German Workers' Party was being incorporated? The reason why I ask is that we have a tendency to think about 1914 as being a huge surprise. All of a sudden, this is a catastrophe. The German Workers' Party has sold out. The same thing happened in France. And we also have a tendency to think of the period from the 1870s up to the First World War as being a time of great poverty among the working class, which for many it was. But it was also a period actually when the overall standard of living for a lot of workers was improving. And also the other thing that strikes me is just how shrewd a politician Bismarck was, not only in anti-socialist laws, which don't seem to have been very effective, but also of bringing in social insurance and making many of the kind of concessions from the top, as it were, in order to head off demands that workers might put forward. And from that point of view, is it not the case that actually the incorporation of the working class, particularly in the context of imperialism, and I'm sure we'll look at that when we come to look at the development of a British Workers' Party, the impact of imperialism of softening some of the worst aspects of capitalism, certainly relative to people's memories within their own lifetime or their grandparents' lifetimes or whatever else. And far from it being socialism at that period being a response to growing immiseration, the party was responding to, on the one hand, there is this argument that if the First World War hadn't broken out, revolution might have broken out sooner. But on the other hand, the British working class, the French working class, the German working class were all seeing significant improvements in their overall standards of living, and to a certain extent, did the incorporation of imperialist ideas among workers, bourgeois notions, actually start much sooner than we give it credit for. And, in a sense, Lenin appears to have been completely surprised, and maybe he failed to understand just how bourgeois the proletariat of Britain, France, and Germany were, and how much earlier they were. Because even in France after the Commune and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine and Alsace and Lorraine. Even notwithstanding the loss of that period was a huge growth in the French economy. It's a fascinating study. That's all.
Interesting question. I've got nobody else with their hand up, so if you want to reply to a few things there, Kevin.
Okay. First of all, on Diane, Marx did refer to GDP, not in those terms, quite a bit, because he took a lot of his statistics, indeed in the address of the First International, he cites the figures for British economic growth, trade and production and so on. So he does refer to it. What I think he does also do, though, is to comment on, the nature of the economy, particularly, the impact that production for production's sake has on both the lives of workers and what we will think of as the environment. There are a number of books that look at Marx's views on the environment, and they come up in different places. There's some in sections in Capital, some stuff on Ireland as well. I think that his arguments would have been around the idea of production for use rather than production for profit and for production's sake. And so he would point to all sorts of, useless production on armaments or, advertising and so on and so forth, and would argue that it would be possible to organize an economy to provide, people's needs. I can't remember the name of any particular book, but I think, what's his name, Foster, John Wilson Foster, has written on Marx and this, but you might want to just look that up, Diane. Maybe if Tina can put the title in the chat. I think Ian's question is an interesting one, and I think that the way I might look at it is I suppose, and this is not a clever way of saying I'm having, my cake and eating it, is dialectically. And that is that in any given period, human beings might opt for one ideology or one political position. And the idea that sort of reformism is sort of inherent, say, in any particular group or tendency, although you could sort of see it in their politics, if it's carried through to an extreme, you take it through to its logical extremes. So you could argue, for example, that in some of in southwestern Germany, particularly in Baden, that there are people who cooperate with the state, and this leads to in voting for budgets, and this leads to a lot of rows in the SPD. And then, of course, you've got people like Vollmar and you've got Bernstein. And indeed, one of the things that I attached, which is for us a slightly later period, is around the time of the anti-socialist law. And they're proposing a publication issued from Zurich about, to be sent into Germany. And Marx is attacking its sort of reformist or revisionist tendencies. So I think the way that I would see it would be to think of it less in terms of original sin, or maybe actually in terms of original sin, that we're all capable of it. It just depends on the context. But I'd certainly think that if you were to try and trace it, you could certainly see in some forms of Lassalleanism. And then maybe what, yes, John Bellamy Foster, that's it. I always get his name wrong. That in, those ideas of the state as an instrument, and that again, Marx in some of the writings in this period refers to people who talk about realpolitik, and he's criticizing them, in those terms. So I think that it might well be implicit in a lot of what people do. And it might well be that that in capitalist society, rather than thinking of it as, a sort of original sin, I'm struggling with the theology a little bit, but that, people who don't believe in the possibilities of change or the desirability or indeed the necessity could reach, compromises. I agree with you about Bismarck. I mean, Bizarrely is always not a hero of mine, but he's someone I've always admired. And I think because he was, fairly perceptive. And apart from the fact that we share a taste in liking Guinness and herrings, he did.
Sorry, Comrade, could you speak sort of straight into the microphone?
Sorry. Yeah. I'm just trying to look at my notes a little bit. So there. So, from that point of view, he was quite perceptive, but he did look very carefully, for example, at what Napoleon did. And unlike many members of the ruling class, he decided that the fear of the universal suffrage was exaggerated, and that it was a calculation worth worth making. However, I think if we think of the socialist movement in that period, I'm perhaps going to put a counter view in, and it's one that's sort of based upon some aspects of my lifetime, and it may well run slightly counter to some sort of existing views, and this might well be worth another discussion. And that is that we tend to think of socialist movements arising sort of from poverty and widespread, deprivation. But if we look at the membership of the SPD, or indeed, I would say, most of the active social movements like the trade unions, that many of them were made of the better off workers, the labor aristocracy. And one of the things that I take from the SPD is that often they were the social class who, in a sense, felt that not only they could be the ruling class, but also the current system was incompetent, it was disorganized. In other words, they were the class of the future. Now, I think of this particularly in relation to the Berlin engineering shop stewards, who were not the lowest paid workers, but were, the center of the German communist movement for a long time. So our arguments about, rising living standards actually I think sometimes give workers a sense of confidence that, you know, that we're not being ground down. If you think about say the period in Britain before the First World War, very high inflation, but it's also a period of some increases in living standards and trade union militancy. And then perhaps near our own time, you know, that the trade union militancy and the political developments of the 60s and 70s were often on the basis of possibility, you know, that capitalism had created these productive resources. And I cite particularly the Labour aristocracy, who sort of saw themselves as, you know, the vanguard. You know, when you see the pictures of the SPD, you know, demonstrations, you see respectable citizens, but you also see people who know how to run things. You know, you know, and I mean, to a certain extent, Weimar proved that you could, you know, you could get rid of the Prussian military bureaucracy and put in Ebert and Scheidemann, and they did a much better job, particularly in eliminating communists. So I think that this issue of incorporation is an interesting one, but I don't think that it's can be solely linked back in a sort of, you know, deterministic way. And I think in particular that periods of growing wealth and indeed can improve self-confidence, you know, and I certainly grew up in a period, and you possibly did as well, though I know you're a little younger than me, you know, when workers felt that they could actually win things, you know, and I think that that is often an important factor, you know, and also what, you know, what the revolution meant. The revolution would not be an act of despair. You know, the German Revolution would be the workers taking over, and it would be relatively, you know, it would be almost like people moving into the factories and saying to the employers, off you go, you know, we don't need you. We run this place. You know, you can go and retire to Lake Constance or wherever you fancy. But, you know, and I think it's that. Now, if you look at, for example, the appeal of Weimar and you look at the appeal of the right socialists, you know, they actually build on that. They actually use that. And that's how they tell people that Weimar is actually the socialist republic. Now, you know, that's wrong. And you can say, well, people should have sort of, you know, realized that, and that shows the depth of reformism. But what it doesn't show is a sort of commitment to capitalism. But I think it's a very interesting question, Ian, and I think it's one both about incorporation and quite how workers see themselves within the system and, you know, their place within it, that I think is important. So, you know, maybe that's a question to be taken up when we look a little later on towards the end of the series.
Thank you. This also touches on the question, you know, does the working class only move when it's really in the dumps, and if it's really, you know, got beaten down, etc., to, you know, rise up against increasing oppression, or, you know, does it actually, as Kevin just pointed out, does it need a certain self-confidence, which comes with having the freedom not to struggle for your survival, you know, day-to-day survival? Are we going to put food on the table, but actually having a sort of freedom to do political work, like, you know, Engels did to a degree, and helped Marx doing it. Great session tonight. Thank you very much, comrade. As Kevin said, we will be returning to the question of Erfurt, the Erfurt program, where Marx played a leading role in drafting, and the minimum maximum program. We'll be looking at that in more detail, but that's in 3 weeks' time, I believe. We're first looking at France next week, and Marx's involvement in drafting the program of the Parti Ouvrier in France, the French Workers' Party, which should also be a very interesting session. Thank you very much, comrades, for participating, and thank you, Kevin, for doing a brilliant introduction. Good night, comrades. See you next week. Bye-bye.